Do we have people joining us? It's not popping up on my screen. Yep. Okay. So want to welcome everyone from DAYL to our CLE. We'll wait a few more minutes before we get started because I know it is right at noon right now. We'll just wait another minute and let people hop on. My name is Taylor Wilson and I have Ben Kirchner here with me, and we are with Steptoe and Johnson, and we'll be talking to you about sanctions and how they're affecting transactional matters today. How are our numbers looking? Got a good group? Lots of people joining. Give it one more minute. It's kind of a rainy day here in Dallas, as most of you know, so I feel like I had struggled to wake up this morning, and Ben's down there in Houston. How's the weather in Houston?
It's sunny and way too hot.
So standard Houston, muggy.
Yes, it's a swamp.
Yeah. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So like I said, my name is Taylor Wilson and I'm here with Ben Kirchner. We are with Steptoe and Johnson PLLC. Although the tag at the bottom says we only have offices in Colorado, Kentucky, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Texas, and West Virginia, we recently opened an office in Oklahoma. So we're also in Oklahoma City. Just wanted to correct that from the get-go. And today we are here presenting on OFAC and sanctions. So our CLE is called Have You Checked OFAC Lately? Sanctions and Their Effects on Transactional Matters. And I have been in Dallas and worked with DAYL since 2014. I used to be leader of the chair of the committee that puts these CLEs on, and I have since passed that torch to Callie and others, but happy to be back with you today. And I want to introduce Ben, who has such a stellar bio that we're going to do this quickly and skip over so many things. But Ben has been the co-chair of both the International Energy Environmental Committee and the International Investment and Development Committees of the American Bar Association International Law Section. Relative to what's happening in the world today, he's also been the co-chair of the Eurasia-Russia Committee of the ABA International Law Section. He has lived overseas and also been involved in these international transactions since 2005 as a summer associate in Palestine. And he has focused lately on energy matters and has been in high demand lately because of the Russia sanctions.
Yes, thanks, Taylor. Appreciate it. It's been a very busy few months.
It has. So we're going to start off because this is kind of a sanctions 101. I want to start off talking about the history of sanctions in the United States. So for modern sanctions, they really started in World War II, and they were first given when the Nazis invaded Denmark and Norway in 1940. So that night, the Undersecretary of the Treasury Department called the New York Federal Reserve and said, just freeze the assets of Denmark and Norway. And that was the first sanctions order. So the goal was to prevent an aggressive country from benefiting from global trade and assets held in the United States. And later they issued an actual presidential executive order that solidified it. But the first real sanctions order was just freeze them, period. So I thought that was a really interesting story, and that's how we've gotten to where we are today. And actually the first license was given 3 years after that, and it was issued to the World Jewish Congress, and the funds would be used to save the Jewish children that were hiding out in France trying to escape France. So we'll talk more about what sanctions are, what a license is, and why that matters, and why it took 3 years for a license to go through the first time. And we'll learn about OFAC and other branches of the government in this CLE. what is OFAC? It's the Office of Foreign Assets Control, housed under the U.S. Department of the Treasury. It administers and enforces economic trade sanctions based on U.S. foreign policy and national security goals against targets, foreign countries and regimes, terrorists, international narcotics traffickers, people and countries engaged in activities related to the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and other threats to national security, foreign policy, or the economy of the U.S. Ben, do you have anything to add about what you feel like OFAC really encompasses here?
So, I mean, they also include, there's the Magnitsky Act, which goes after, corrupt people worldwide. So they have that in their purview. They're often referred to as a black box. They aren't very communicative. If you only talk to them once they talk to you first. Otherwise, that's it. They don't take questions.
That's not a good thing.
No.
You don't want to be contacted by OFAC.
So can go to the next slide.
Sure. So what are sanctions, Ben?
So sanctions are specifically what OFAC deals with are economic sanctions. Sanctions prevent U.S. persons or U.S. entities from engaging in transactions with designated foreign persons or entities. So in this case, a U.S. person is obviously any U.S. company, any of their affiliates overseas. So if you have a U.S. company and they have an affiliate in Germany, that would also count, which means gives it a pretty broad reach. Basically anything is going to be a U.S. person if you have any sort of nexus with the U.S. And they can be, OFAC does the economic sanctions, then you have, changes to various export rules about dual use items, the EAR, and so those get ratcheted up too. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But basically, sanctions prevent you from doing a transaction. There's licenses that can be granted in limited circumstances, and you have to apply for most of those on a case-by-case basis. However, there's also general licenses for humanitarian aid, medical devices, some legal services, not all. I have a friend whose firm represents the Islamic Republic of Iran. They have to get paid by congressional act twice a year. And then there's also, so I'm trying to think, yeah. So and general licenses are mostly going to be denied, but occasionally you can get them. Sorry, the specific licenses. The general licenses also, the wind down times are usually 30 days. But in the case of the Russia sanctions, a lot of those have been extended to 60 days, but you really have to look at your specific transaction.
And one of the interesting things that I've recently learned about those wind down and the sanctions that are targeted towards credit, we've dealt with a client that if you don't get paid within those 60 days of the wind down, can you go after that invoice later?
I wouldn't.
Right, I wouldn't either.
All right. Yeah. First piece of practical advice for this is if you're dealing with the country with any sort or area with any sort of sanctions, you're going to want to get paid up front, because whether or not terms of payment that last longer than 14 days may be in violation of sanctions.
So speaking of people that didn't heed that advice, this year alone, OFAC has issued civil penalties totaling over $12 million as of July 21st this year. And it's not just Russian sanctions. The people that have received these civil penalties have violated the Cuban assets control regulations, Iran transaction sanction regulations, Ukraine related sanction regulations, the North Korea transaction and sanctions regulations, Venezuela sanctions, narcotics kingpin sanctions regulations, and the weapons of mass destruction proliferation sanctions and regulations. These have been in place a wide variety of years. So it's not just sanctions that are happening and changing all the time with Russia, but it's things that have been in place for a long time that are still being breached. And part of the problem is that we'll get into is that strict liability. So even though you might have controls set in place, you might still end up owing civil penalties to OFAC. So let's get into some of those types of sanctions and how to maintain compliance with them.
Sure. So the three main types of sanctions that OFAC deals with are, number one, a full blocking sanction, which would be on specially designated nationals and blocked persons. Mr. Putin's girlfriend, Alina Kabayeva, would fall under this. Lots of people like that. There's also larger sanctions, like the North Korea and Cuba ones, where just you can't do anything at all. We can still actually trade with Russia. Then you have debt and equity restrictions, which put on limits to how much you can invest in a sanctioned entity. Sometimes they'll be limited. And then, like we said about the debt earlier, that can be your payment terms, which is why you want to get paid as soon as possible. And then correspondent and payable through account sanctions are dealing specifically with financial companies. And what correspondent and payable through account is where a foreign bank works with a U.S. bank, and the U.S. bank basically does transactions on behalf of the foreign bank. And so those are the three main types of sanctions that OFAC deals with. And I think we forgot to say, if you have any questions, just pop them into the Q&A and we'll try to answer those as they come in.
And also in that same chat box, towards the end, there'll be the CLE code as well. So make sure you write that down once Sherry puts it in the box. So let's get more specific into the Russia sanctions.
Sure. So as everybody knows, earlier this year, Russia invaded Ukraine and they also went through Belarus. So Belarus is seen as complicit. There was a huge flurry of activity in March and April, where the US, along with the UK, the EU, Japan, Singapore, Switzerland, of all places, imposed very significant sanctions on Russia and Belarus as a result of that invasion. Specifically, these sanctions cover the Donetsk and Luhansk regions in the southeast of Ukraine. They target the Russian banking, energy, and tech sectors, as well as luxury goods. And so I think a few things to think about is, so you can't send anything to Donetsk or Luhansk. You also can't send anything to Crimea, which Russia invaded in 2014. For good measure, I'm shocked they haven't added South Ossetia and Abkhazia in Georgia and Transnistria and Moldova. If you're doing business in those places, you need to talk to somebody, because I'm sure the sanctions would widen a lot. I think the EU is on their 6th or 7th round of sanctions, almost about once a month. They keep adding some more. The US has slowed down our pace, but it's still, Russia went from being fairly lightly sanctioned to now being by far the most sanctioned country in the world from the US perspective.
And not just the US, I mean, like you mentioned the US, but worldwide, there's Switzerland, who usually is neutral, and also typically neutral. Sweden, Finland, and Israel issued their own sanctions as well. So it's an unprecedented use of sanctions. Some are calling economic warfare, but I think that's a little strong of a term, but it is the largest use of sanctions the US and the world as a whole have ever had. Isn't that correct?
By number, yes, not by actual effect.
Right. But individual ones.
Yeah.
And they also have, I don't know that we mentioned it, but aerospace is also sanctioned. Is that correct?
It is, but so the energy and the finance are clearly sanctioned. Aerospace is from Russian planes can't fly outside of Russia to a large extent. However, recently VSMPO, which is the biggest producer of titanium in the world, which is based in West Siberia, they were on the list for a short amount of time. They realized, hey, Airbus and Boeing aren't going to be able to build planes if we sanction them. So got to keep track of exactly what's going on.
So the lobbyists had a hand in changing this, is what you're saying.
Yeah. Yes.
So I think one of the most difficult things is figuring out if you're doing business with someone that falls under this 50% rule. I know that there's public information, but can you explain the 50% rule?
Sure. The 50% rule is because they're concerned about, stepping back a little bit, sanctions are very pointed. If something isn't specifically denied by a sanction, then it's allowed. The 50% rule applies to ownership of a company, not necessarily control of a company. So if you have the owner of the company owns 51% and they are a specially designated national, then the company would also be sanctioned. This would include in the aggregate where if you had, 4 people who had 50% or more, then they add it up. But you'd also have to look to make sure it's the same type of sanction. It gets a little bit, when you're doing the aggregation, it can get pretty hazy quickly.
And I think part of the issue with that 50% rule is also whether it's ownership or a lot of what we look at on the corporate side is beneficial ownership.
Yeah. So
talk about how to figure out what that is.
Short answer, good luck, pray. At least, if you're for most of the sanctioned companies and entities, the corporate structure is rather opaque. OFAC has their SDN list, and the Department of Commerce Bureau of Industry and Security, which we'll talk about in a little bit, also has something called a consolidated screening list, which adds the OFAC SDN list and a few other lists. But because of the 50% rule, these lists are only naming the specifically sanctioned entity or individual, not necessarily every company they own. And, trying to research who owns what percent of a company is not always easy. These largely are not publicly traded companies, or if they are, it's still not easy to track down. You can go to the OFAC list, and that's a great place to start, but you're going to have to do some research to dig into the ownership. And some of it's publicly available. A lot of it you're going to have to do digging through company websites or use a third-party vendor that can give you some lists.
And this will be especially important in not just export and import and doing business with them, but also in M&A work as well. When you're looking at who those shareholders are. So for all of the young attorneys out there, this is something that you want to dig into during due diligence and get to that early, because the further down the line you get, as you'll see in this next slide, the more liable you are for damages and sanctions.
Yeah, and that's not just an overseas problem, that's a US problem. Nevada, the Dakotas, or you can't tell who owns what if the corporation's registered there. I mean, I see all sorts of my overseas counterparts complaining about us not being.
Wyoming has become the leader now in remaining anonymous. So for privacy concerns, if you're starting a company, that's the place to go now. So it changes every time Nevada or Delaware or someone changes their tax rules there. So with banking compliance, what I see, I do a lot of commercial lending, and what I've seen is we're having to really ramp up and be more thorough with our OFAC searches when we're doing any kind of lending, whether it's commercial lending or if we're buying a portfolio of mortgages. We have to look at each borrower and make sure that they aren't on the blocked persons list. And one of the biggest problems that has created liability for banks is IT not pushing updates for these searches that you see in banking compliance. If IT gets an update from OFAC for their tools that they use in-house, then you need to make sure that your IT person is pushing that as a critical update that has to go out immediately, because if it doesn't update till the weekend, you might be liable for those up to 5 days that you were doing searches and not including the most recent list. Another issue we see with hard money lenders and non-institutional investors is they don't have this type of compliance software. So you need to actually do the OFAC search that he was talking about at that website at the bottom of the screen, sanctionsearch.ofac.treas.gov. And I've got a screenshot here on the next page so you can see how this looks. Recommended you do all on the programs, but you can target the programs, but you do need more information about who you're searching, and you probably need to do a lot of different searches to really get it correct when you're having to do it manually.
Yeah, a couple comments on that. Oh, the third party vendors are very good, but they tend to only update once a week. So a practice tip is, if you're involved in this, OFAC has an RSS feed and they'll send you updates through that, or you can sign up for emails. So I get those, pretty much at least once or twice a week, because oftentimes people get added to the list, they get taken off, all sorts of stuff. You need to keep up with that. For the sanctions list search, I use the OFAC search as a secondary one. I use the Trade Administration's consolidated search list first, because I sort of want to catch a wide net, and that has more lists, including the OFAC SDN list. And then if you get a hit on that, then you go here to get more information.
Do you have a recommendation because all you need is name and state or province, but how do you really make sure that you get adequate results from this search?
So I type in first name, I type in last name, separate searches, the whole name. The consolidated search list has more fuzzy language capabilities, which helps for dealing with countries where they don't have alphabets or have non-Latin alphabets. So it's, I do general, and then if I see something even vaguely close, then I start digging down, because it's just, you want to catch problems. You don't want to be too specific and have your head in the sand.
One of the recent penalties that occurred was a bank was allowing transactions in a small town where a woman owned a bakery or owned a store, was importing Russian baked goods. And they didn't catch that transaction. I believe it was in Oklahoma. And so the bank was fined. So that leads us into the penalty section. It can be as simple as that if you're a bank. It's just, no one thought in this small town that anyone had anything to do with Russia. And it turns out someone with a store was importing baked goods.
Yeah. So, and just, I want to back up and just talk about the banking issue. One of the, and sort of focused on Russia, the big problem we're seeing with complying with the Russia sanctions, and why there is such a broad amount of over compliance. A lot of transactions are still allowed, but because we've sanctioned the central bank in Russia, getting money in and out of Russia is super difficult right now without going through China or Turkey or, a bunch of third, fourth, fifth parties that you really don't want to have to deal with. So you've got to look at the practicality, even if you have a transaction that, hey, I'm sure this is allowed, like I want to send medical supplies. That'd be fine. But can you actually find a boat to put it on? Can you find someone who's willing to accept the payments from Russia? Maybe. And is it worth your time and hassle to go through those hoops and document everything, because you can be sure that someone's going to be looking into you?
So let's talk about the strict liability on sanctions. Like we talked about, small banks in Oklahoma are liable for not catching these type of things. We can see the fines up to $1 million, but I believe there's also prison time that can be associated with it as well. Is that correct?
Yes, depending on the blatantness of it, I guess.
I think the maximum time I read was 20 years. I haven't seen that. Have you seen anything close to that?
No, but again, that's per violation. And the reason if you have 5 transactions, each one, would be a violation. I think the reason they do that is gives them wiggle room to sort of negotiate with you and to get your cooperation. Because at the end of the day, they don't want to be punitive. They just want to prevent goods going where they're not supposed to go.
So documented compliance efforts, let's talk about what is a good, we talked about the searches that you do, but what can you do as outside counsel or in-house that can boost your compliance efforts and the documentation that you have?
So, first of all, you have to actually have a policy in place. And it's very important that it's not just lip service. It has to be enabled and empowered by senior management. It has to be comprehensive. You need to have sanctions compliance, you have export compliance, technology control, anti-corruption, anti-money laundering, anti-forced labor compliance. You need to educate people so that people know what's going on and why this is important. And then lastly, you need to document every step that you take, whether that's internally or through your outside counsel. Really, and if you're in the steps, the people you have to monitor, it's not just, okay, who's my end user? My end user is in Germany. Well, are they selling the product? Are they re-exporting it somewhere? You need to know your customer. KYC is the phrase used in the industry. It's very important. You need to know who's your freight forwarder, what boats are they putting it on, what ports, who owns. It gets. We had one situation where the problem was, all the ports in the country are owned by bad people, so that's an issue. It's not just running a simple search through the OFAC sanctions list. It's a lot more comprehensive than that. And if you can demonstrate that you made good faith efforts with buy-in from above, that management takes it seriously and has a culture of compliance, they've allocated assets, they're doing this, making good faith effort, that's going to mitigate the fines and or penalties a lot.
So you're talking about some of these other departments or bureaus that are involved in this, not just OFAC, but we've got the U.S. Department of Commerce's Bureau of Industry and Security. You mentioned BIS, and also earlier you mentioned EAR. We've got the Export Administration regulations, and then for importing, you've also got the Customs and Border Protection. Sorry about that typo. Customs and Border Protection, CBP. So talk about how those all interact with OFAC as well.
So there's also the ITAR regulations, International Trade and Arms regulations, which are administered by the Department of State. And so those are for weapons or directly military related items that are exported. That's a much smaller list. The Export Administration regulations that BIS does have to do with dual use items. So like carbon fiber, Carbon fiber can be used for bicycles. It can be used to make missiles. So it's sort of, it's controlled depending on what type of carbon fiber, where it's going. The EAR is very complex, and you have to classify the items, and then you have to look at what country it's going to. And there's charts that tell you, okay, for this use, if it's category 1, it's okay. If it's a category 2 country, you have to get a license, category 3, et cetera. And in my practice, BIS is one of the easier governmental agencies to interact with. They do have a law enforcement aspect, but they're much more concerned with not letting the bad stuff go to the bad guys. If you're having trouble getting your item classified, you email, call them, and they will help you classify it. Because especially if you're just getting started exporting, how you classify it, I don't know. I don't know how it's done. It's very complicated. And then Customs and Border Protection, they do, obviously, they're tasked with making sure that what leaves is what it says it is, that sort of stuff. That's under they act under the foreign trade regulations, which also covers imports and harmonized tariff schedules.
Well, they've been in the news a lot lately because we've got the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act that was signed into law on December 23rd of 2021. And I think a lot of it got drowned out by the Russia talk earlier in the year, but this has been something that was a long time coming. Everyone was prepared for it. Everyone knew what was happening. But then it finally got signed into law, and now you're really seeing the effects of the law now. So for those that don't know, it applies to all goods, wares, articles, and merchandise mined, produced, or manufactured wholly or in part. And I'm going to let you say the name of this, Ben, because I'm going to butcher it.
Sure. Well, I'm probably one of the few attorneys in the U.S. who has actually studied Uyghur. It's the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. It's in the extreme northwest of the People's Republic of China. Half the population is ethnically Han Chinese. That's a new development in the last 20 years. Prior to that, it was almost exclusively a Turkic area, some Mongolians. Uyghur is a Turkic language. There's a lot of, they're largely Muslim. You really don't, it's not what people think of when they think of China. But there's been some rumblings that they want to separate from China. And so as a result, China has sort of dropped the hammer, for lack of a better term. And there's a lot of forced labor issues. It's really the Orwellian 1984 police state is just through the roof, just terrifying.
And this area is different in its treatment compared to Tibet and Taiwan, because you're talking about China wanting to drop the hammer. Unfortunately, it has at least 3 of these hammers. It's trying to 4, if you count Hong Kong. So we've got multiple areas that are affected by China's one China policy that the U.S. Respects, but this one is different, and we have different issues here because of the forced labor camps, correct?
Yeah, and so what part of what they're doing is re-education / forced labor camps, and they're putting, I've seen reports where it's 1 out of every 7 adults in Xinjiang is in one of these camps or has been. But but we're really I would almost say calling it UFLPA is a little bit of a misnomer because it applies to really any forced labor in China that's done. It applies to anything produced with forced labor in Xinjiang, and also anything produced with forced labor outside of Xinjiang by certain ethnic minorities, Uyghurs, Kazakhs, Tibetans, or even North Korean nationals. So it's sort of part of a trend that forced labor is a worldwide issue that enforcement and regulation has been really ramping up the last 3 or 4 years.
So you were talking about it not just being in this region. So that's why I went ahead and switched to the next slide, because you've got the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force. So that's really broader than just this region. But right now, the act that we're looking at is focused on the region. But the problem is it's not just the region, it's your entire supply chain that has to be in compliance, correct?
Right. So if, I mean, since the solar panels are really the item that is most effective, most an issue in the US at the moment. Solar panels made from silicon. Most of the solar panels produced in China come from Xinjiang. So, ergo, you can't currently get solar panels from China into the US. But even if they aren't produced in Xinjiang, where did the raw materials come from? Likely Xinjiang. So it would still be, you still wouldn't be able to get it into the US because of where it was originally produced. So you have to go back your supply chain. For the forced labor stuff, you have to go back until it comes out of the ground, basically. And then for the sanctions, then we have to go all the way to our end user. So you really have to, the whole, everything from, as we say in the oil and gas industry, from drill tip to, to burner head, you really have to do compliance all the way around.
The one I find most interesting is the tomatoes and downstream tomato products. Are we worried that our canned tomatoes we're making spaghetti sauce out of are coming from that area?
I don't think so. I know the tomato products I get either come from Italy or Indiana, of all places. I don't think that's a big issue. We had somebody who was concerned, well, what if our employees in Shanghai are eating tomato products? It's like, no, it has to be something that's actually going to be imported to the US. I think the tomato products, probably not too many of those are going to make it here. Silica stuff, in case of solar panels, yes. Cotton has been a big issue in the past. There was a case 2 years ago, I think, against H&M. They really focused on cotton a lot because it's a big problem.
I know you laughed that you have a client that asked that question, but I think that really goes to your looking at both ends of the spectrum. And we've got some questions here that young attorneys should make sure they ask the clients. Do you want to talk about these questions you came up with?
Sure. So, really, it's know your customer, know your client. So what are you selling? Is it going to be controlled under EAR or ITAR or anything else? Have you mapped your entire supply chain? Who are you going to sell it to? Are they on a list? Are there owners? What are they using the goods for? Who are their clients? And the other thing, to go back to the lists. So even that consolidated screening list that the Trade Administration has, it doesn't include the UFLPA list, which is right now about 20 or so entities. And then, if you're doing agricultural exports, Department of Agriculture and the FDA both have separate lists that are only going to be on their websites. So you have to, sort of drill down industry specific.
Now, when you're saying boats and ports, you're talking freighters, not just those yachts that all of the UK members are searching for and locking down.
Yeah. No, I mean, because yes, the luxury yachts are sort of a big deal, but I'm talking about how it's getting there. Where's the shipping container? What boat is it traveling on? And there are specific boats that have been sanctioned. And specific ports that can be sanctioned, and the owners of them. So you have to really follow your goods the whole way. How is it being financed? You've got to run the SWIFT codes to make sure that one of the banks that the money is going to pass through isn't sanctioned. That's a real big concern.
One of the concerns when you're talking about finance is the fact that structuring is forbidden. So you really have to protect your company from inadvertently financing or structuring a deal Can you talk about how those rules affect when you're creating a deal that has multiple companies and multiple the different entities in the supply chain?
So, I mean, it's, it's sort of, it's your intake process. You just have to run each and every one, and to the extent that you can reasonably find their beneficial owners, how to run them. And a lot of this sounds really overwhelming, at least at first. A lot of this can be not automated, but it can be incorporated into your existing M&A due diligence checklists. Okay, like this is actually a domestic inbound thing. For CFIUS, there's a new real estate portion of it. And so, just when you're looking up the real estate, you happen to run it through the CFIUS real estate GIS map to make sure it's not close to anything of concern. So it's not as once you get up and running. Until then, that's it.
You're right. It does seem like a lot, especially for a young attorney that might just be lower on the totem pole in this M&A transaction, and it's their job to do this due diligence. So it can seem like a lot, but you do have some best practices. We talked about having really good compliance and sanction policy within the client company, but what about for the young attorneys that are advising the clients or helping actually do some of that due diligence for them?
So, I mean, obviously attending this helps. But you gotta read a lot. I've attended more CLEs this year, I think, than I have any other year in my life, just because so much is changing so fast. So you gotta read your industry publications, go to CLEs, and just keep up with what the government agencies are doing, because it changes on a daily basis, or at the very least a weekly basis, Friday at 5 p.m. to be convenient to everybody.
Speaking of that, we've got listed here, use the Incoterms that are favorable to the seller. So those are updated at least yearly, correct?
No, Incoterms are updated about once every 10 years. So we're currently using the 2020, which just came to Incoterms, but still I have quite a few clients that still use the 2010 ones. I like them. I have a few deals that are with the 1990 version, because they do change them. And Incoterms are not the same as traditional U.S. shipping terms. So make sure what you're actually agreeing to.
So these are for import and export, international contracts. Can you explain what the name means for young lawyers?
So Incoterms, just international commercial terms, and it's the International Chamber of Commerce, I think in the 20s or 30s, got together to harmonize shipping terms internationally. And for this, if you're concerned about anything with sanctions, then you're going to want to push very hard for the terms that are most favorable to the seller, which would basically be, I will make it ready at my factory, and then that's it. And there's insurance issues that hinge on those. When the risk of loss versus the risk of title transfers. It's not usually something most people find interesting.
Well, one of the red flags, I think, when we're talking about not in line with historical norms is harder to figure out when you're talking about force majeure, because you had all of 2020 when the pandemic hit. That was the thing about all the CLEs. Everyone was talking about changing the force majeure language in your contracts. And now you have Russia invading another country. Well, really started in 2014, but it's definitely something that's come up a lot now. Can you talk about how, whether it's a red flag or whether you're changing with the times in this type of language?
So I think, I mean, changing with the times is sort of easy to account. I think sort of easy to account for. But if you're all of a sudden getting a lot of orders from Dubai and you've never sold anything there. Why? Where are they going? Because the thing you have to remember about export rules is you're on the hook for what are re-exports, which is if the person you sell it to then sells it to Iran, yeah, you're in trouble, especially if it's, a shady business where it's like a brokerage with no website and you can't track down who they are. They just happen to be in Dubai. Yeah, that's a red flag. Or, in the case of Russia, okay, you used to sell 30,000 tons a year of this good to Russia, but magically now you're selling it in China, the exact same amount. Why, you got to be it's just sort of, you just got to pay attention and vet your customers pretty thoroughly and document everything.
Yeah, document everything. I think we've pretty much covered this slide, but just to really hammer it into everyone, over compliance. So you've got people that you were talking about that might not allow the transaction, even though it's something that has a license or is welcomed as a legitimate transaction, such as medical needs. And you've got banks and shippers. You said some boats might not carry it, just being over compliant, if you will. What's your advice for documenting when you're trying to convince a partner that this transaction is legitimate and let's all move forward?
So this is the fine line between make sure that you're trying to comply and not evade sanctions. The advice you've been given is for complying, not trying to evade. That's real close. But you sort of have to point out to it. But a lot of that you document. Okay, it isn't forbidden by anything. It's not sanctioned, so we should be able to send it. I mean, they may just have a policy where you can't, without rerouting it through 3 or 4 different countries. So you have to make a business decision. Is it worthwhile? It may or may not be. It's been very difficult. I know I've been asked to represent some sanctioned entities for Russia. Respectfully said, I don't think I can get paid for that, even if I'm legally allowed to. So
that was my first thought: is how would you get paid?
For lawyers, that's important.
I know we focused on Russia and the Uyghur area. So there's also tons of other sanctions that have been on the books for many years. They don't automatically sunset, although some of them do have time limits, but really a lot of them can't be lifted until the threat is gone, correct?
Right. Or like in the case of Libya, a lot of them are on the Gaddafi regime. The Gaddafi regime fell a decade or so ago, but they're still, until they're removed, they're still in effect. And obviously Libya, there's still a civil war thing, and it's difficult. So yeah, you got to be real careful with that. The other issue is the third bullet point here that, like going way back, I made the example of, your US company, you have an affiliate in Germany. So right there, you're subject to EU sanctions, not just US sanctions. And the lists of the EU use are not the same as our lists, which are different from the Canadian lists, which are different from the UK lists. So you're really going to need to involve local counsel for multiple jurisdictions, depending on where everything's coming from and where stuff is going through. And just for one example, one of the biggest oil refineries in Russia, the owner is sanctioned by UK, EU, and Canada, but not by the US. So if you're doing something, you may be able to do that. And then Canada, the US, we have restrictions on oil and gas energy sector. In Canada, they also have restrictions on the chemical production sector. So That's different than energy, but it's really closely related. So transactions that would be allowed here aren't allowed there.
Well, we only have 10 more minutes, so if anyone has any questions, please make sure you get them in now. While I had way more slides than necessary, I think we're gonna skip over some of the international contracts, but I do think it would be really helpful to explain that while we use the UCC a lot in the commercial lending side of my practice, we've got to look at something else when you're doing international contracts, the CISG. Can you explain real quickly what that is?
Sure. Well, I remember when I took Article 2 sales, one of the first things they told us was, anytime you draft a contract, you want to contract out of the CISG. Recently, I was dealing with a matter in Poland, and unfortunately, no attorneys were consulted when the $40 million contract was drafted, and it didn't have any choice of law provisions. And so I was talking to our Polish counterparts, and I was like, well, you guys are more familiar with CISG. And their response was, no, we contract out of it all the time, just like you do. But basically, it's if you don't specifically opt out of it, this is what you're going to default to. And the important thing to be aware of is it is different than UCC Article 2. Even though the terms may be the same, the details are not. It's also not as fleshed out as the UCC. But to opt out of it, you would have to say, we're going to operate under the laws of the state of New York, or under the UCC as enacted by the state of New York, specifically exclude the CISG as well.
That's very important on our lending side. We use that language even if we're not trying to get out of the CISG. You want to make sure that your contracts, your loan agreements, any of those contracts where you're also secured by whether it's real property or asset based, you want to make sure that you're specific about what states UCC laws you're working under as well. Because if you're doing something here in Texas, but you're specifically negotiating under the New York ones, some of them might differ depending on what you're looking at, whether it's real estate asset based. So for all the young attorneys out there, it's not just boilerplate language. It actually matters, which I know we've had in the past whole CLEs on why boilerplate language can trip you up. So just make note of that if you're a young attorney working on contracts. So let's talk about the offer and acceptance, because that seems to be the biggest difference.
So basically, the CISG doesn't have the mailbox. Yeah, it has it's different from the mailbox. Acceptance has to be received by the offeror, and the reply to the offer containing additional terms or limitations rejects the offer and is a counter offer. So it's not the mailbox, which is what we're all familiar with. And
of course, the statute of frauds. Now, we love the statute of frauds here in Texas, but it looks like internationally, not a thing.
No. And just to go back to the choice of law thing, it's there's some disagreement under the CISG if there is no choice of law provision, whether it would be where the good was produced or where it's supposed to be to. Usually it's going to be where it was produced, but you can make some arguments the other way around too.
And let's get onto the parole evidence rule as well.
Sure. Basically, CISG, they don't have a parole evidence rule. You can bring it in, particularly if it is going to affect or vary how the contract was written. As one of UCC, there's parole evidence allowed. Can't contradict the terms within the 4 corners of the document.
We've got a lot more slides, so I'm actually gonna cut it off there so we can leave time. I don't see any questions coming in, but just want to let you know, if you do want the whole, we've got 20 more slides on this. So if you do want the whole presentation, feel free to reach out to me or Ben let me go back to our very first slide, and you'll see our contact information, our emails here. Sherry put the CLE course number in the chat, so please make sure you copy that down before we end the webinar. And it is 1 hour of CLE today, so make sure you go enter that on the Texas Bar website. If you need help self-reporting, I'm sure someone on that site can show you how. And do you have any last like practical guidance, Ben, before we wrap up?
Just really document everything, and you need to have buy-in from senior management. You don't want to create a culture of corruption or work somewhere that allows that.
Great. Well, I think that's pretty easy for young attorneys to do. We love to paper all the deals, right? That's our job. So just continue to talk to your clients and make sure your clients are being open and honest about where the products are going and the pertinent issues in the deal, and make sure that you're on top of all of those searches, as we talked about, ITAR and OFAC and all of those. So if you have any questions, once again, you can email us. My name is Taylor Wilson, and this is Ben Kirchner, and we are with Steptoe and Johnson, and it's been a pleasure.
Thanks. I really appreciate it. It's a lot of fun.